All right, so we are on week 3 of a series called Vapor, looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. And so to recap you just a little bit, we talked about how the Bible is composed of a number of different books and a number of different genres. The Bible is not just sections of law. There's actually these beautiful narrative pieces talking about characters and people and things that have happened in history. There's moments that are poetic, where these people are writing out these prayers and songs to God to express what's on their heart. There's letters, people that walked with Jesus writing to the church to help instruct them and everything. And then there's this little section that maybe doesn't get used a whole ton. It's called wisdom literature. And we talked about these last couple of weeks how for the early followers of God, they had two spectrums, right? They had a spectrum of things that were right and wrong, but that doesn't answer every single question that we have, right? Stephanie's family was going to go look at a sofa earlier today. They can't open up the Word and say, Lord, we want to buy a sofa. Is this right or wrong, right? You know, when you're going to date somebody, just sometimes it's like kind of apparent. It's like, that might be wrong, right? But a lot of times it doesn't operate on that scale of right and wrong. And so they had this whole other category for making decisions that was a spectrum of wisdom versus foolishness, right? That you might not have a right or wrong on buying the sofa or dating the person or taking a job, but using the principles and stuff in God's Word, you can approach things and make a wise decision. And you can do other things that aren't necessarily wrong, but they're foolish, and it can have consequences. And so our first week, we looked at this word. It's a Hebrew word I'm teaching y'all. It's called hevel. Everybody say hevel. Hevel, like Hevel kind of thing, hevel, right? And hevel is a word that in your translation you'll see it'll say things like vanity or meaningless, or sometimes it calls it vapor, but the plain meaning of it is like a smoke or a vapor. And he uses this word to talk about how everything in life is temporary, that each and every one of us, eventually we die and we're forgotten. And the things that we build and the work that we do eventually fades and it's forgotten. And the people around us also die and they're forgotten. He says, basically, he kind of opens the book, like, hevel of hevels, everything is utterly hevel. It's like vapor. And that word doesn't just mean something's temporary, it also means that there's like an absurdity to it. The other night, last night, it was like super cold. And so I stepped out of the house and I breathed and my breath just kind of out there or whatever. You got to reach for it and like it shoots this way and another one shoots this other way and stuff. And so they use that sometimes to describe things that are nonsensical. And so he looks out over the whole course of life and he says, man, everything is hevel. It's this vapor. As soon as it's there, it's gone. And it's also kind of absurd. It's hard to make sense of. And so he's used that to try to put things in perspective. Last week, when we did chapter 2, a couple weeks ago we did chapter 2, we talked about this thing that he describes as the chase. He's looking for the thing in life that will fulfill him and make him feel whole. And so he looks at wisdom and he chases wisdom and he becomes like just the wisest guy that he can. But what he says, his conclusion at the end of this journey is that he's chasing the wind. Right? You go outside right now and you try to catch the wind, like put it in there. It's futile, it just keeps going. You can keep chasing it on and on and on. And so he says, what if it's not wisdom, what if it's pleasure? And he chases pleasure to the farthest end he can. And he gets all these like wives and servants and all this money and everything. And he says at one point, I used my wisdom to tell my body how best to like get myself joyful with wine. Right? He's using his like faculties to do this. He tried toiling, like building different things and all this stuff. And at the end of all of it, his conclusion was, he said, man, all of these things, if I had 500 years on this earth, I would still be chasing these things, like chasing the wind. If I'm looking for that to fulfill me and make me whole, I'm going to chase wisdom and pleasure and work all the way to the end of eternity. All this stuff's vapor. As soon as I lay hold of it, whoosh, it slips through my fingers. And when he came to the determination, now this brings us up to the present, was that all these things are a gift from God. That wisdom in and of itself can never make somebody whole, but it is a gift. It is something that God gives us to help us make better decisions, right? Pleasure is not necessarily something that's evil, but it's a gift. But whenever those things try to move from being gifts to take the place of God, that try to take this place of something ultimate that fulfills us, they break because they can't bear the weight of our worship. And so he's telling them, look, don't let the gift replace the giver. And it brings us to chapter 3 tonight. Here's something I know about each of us coming in. Each of us are in a season of life. You're either moving into a season right now. Maybe you're in the middle of one. You've been there for a little while. Maybe you're moving out of a season. But life is made up of these temporary chapters that normally we can look back on and say, oh, this was a season, and this was a season, this was a season, that we move through. And sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes there's a mixture of them. What he's going to do tonight is he's going to share that there's a place for all of these different seasons that we encounter. But he's got some wisdom in the midst of it that I want to show you. And so, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we'll kind of start walking together in verse 1. He says, for everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek, a time to lose. A time to keep, a time to cast away. A time to tear, a time to sow. A time to keep silence, a time to speak. A time to love, a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. He's letting us know each of these 28 different occasions that there's a time that it's appropriate and it's best for that season to be there. Some of you have maybe been to a funeral before where there's that one person, like everybody's really somber and sad and contemplative, and there's that one person that's walking around and you just cringe, because they're saying like, oh, what's everybody upset about? Like, man, we know they're dead. What's everybody upset about? And they're trying to like be real cheerful. Like, come on, laugh or whatever. And you're like, no, this is not wrong time, wrong place, right? Or sometimes when somebody's going through just a lot of heartache and a lot's going on, or actually, y'all being married, you probably also know this illustration as well. There's sometimes it's better to keep silent than to speak. That they just need somebody to be there with them in that moment, Or sometimes, one of you might be venting, and the other one might say, oh, do you want advice? Or, no, I want to be heard. I don't want advice right now, man. And so there's times that each of these different seasons can be appropriate in its own way. There's times that it's better to weep for something than to laugh. There's a time, this is wild for us to consider, there's a time when evil and darkness is going on, and you see injustice, that it's better to make war on that than to sit back and pretend that there's peace. There's other times, man, it's best to be in peace. Each of these seasons, there's an appropriateness to each of them. The second thing I want us to consider about it, though, is that you can't control these a lot of times. So sometimes our decisions can kind of affect what season we're in, but a lot of times, you don't know when these things are coming up, they just sort of come upon you. Each year, you can't control when it moves from winter to spring to summer to fall. In the same way, we can't look at our calendar and schedule, this day I'm going to have a season of grief, and it's going to last from 1 p.m. till 2:05 p.m., and then I'm going to be done with it. And on these days, I'm going to have a season of laughter. On these days, we're going to have a season of peace, and on these other days, we're going to know. All of a sudden, that's not how that works. These times come upon us, and we have very little, if any, control over these seasons as they happen. And so because of this, and this is kind of where he's going to get us moving, because these things come and go without our say, without our control, the wisest thing that we can do is to try to figure out how to live within those seasons as they happen. Some people, and we don't consider it this way, some people look at the season of their life and they put all of their anxiety and all of their stress and all of their worry into trying to change something that they can't change. We think it would be silly if somebody sat at home and stressed about how they're going to keep summer from coming, right? Or how they're going to keep this other season from changing. To a large extent, these things are out of our hands. Somebody else does something or something happens in the world and these relational seasons kind of shift. The people that we were once dancing with, we might be mourning at another time. So there's a wisdom in accepting that these things are out of our control. And it leads us to the next kind of principle that he wants. He wants us to see all of these different seasons happen to us, and we don't ultimately have control. It's outside of our hands. There's something going on beyond us, perpetuating these seasons. But he asks this question in verse 9. He says, what gain has the worker from his toil? He says, I've seen the business that God has given the children of man to be busy with. Right? This is the task, I'll just use the word, the business, the busyness, right, that God has given to us. And he has two things there. He says, one, he has made everything beautiful in its time. We can look at this list, and some of these things, we could go one by one and say, man, there's sometimes that there's a beauty in each of these things. There's some things that I keep using this example as we go through the book. There, at the very end of the show, The Office. This is not an endorsement of The Office, but it makes a great point. At the very end of The Office, one of the characters, Andy, looks at the camera and he says, I wish there was a way you could know you were in the good old days before the good old days were gone. You know, I wish there was a way that in that season I would have been aware that these things were happening. And what he's saying is like, man, God has, in his sovereignty, made everything in its time. There's something that's beautiful there, to be cherished, to be enjoyed. Even in the seasons of mourning, in the seasons of laughter, in the seasons of dancing, in the seasons of casting things away, there's something beautiful that happens in these things. And so if we spend our time trying to stress about the season that we're in, we miss the beauty that he's put there. Okay? And so that's part one of it, right? This is what he's given us to be busy with, that he's made these things beautiful that they can be enjoyed. And then secondly, it says also he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. There's a reason why people love like ongoing love stories or like happily ever after kind of things. There's a longing in us that I think the scripture's saying that God has put in there, that in our heart there's this longing for something that's eternal. And so even in the midst of, there's this tension. God's made everything beautiful in its time, right? And all of its temporary vapor glory, right? That, man, I could be in this season right now, enjoying this, seeing the beauty of like the friends that I have, the people he's put me around, or just, you know, even like the beauty in like our sadness and God being there with us, right? There's all this beauty, but there's a part of our heart, and this is by design. He says God put it there. There's a part of our heart that longs for something that is outside of the cycle and that breaks the cycle. It's something above all these seasons. It's something that's permanent, that won't go away. So there's a beauty in the vapor. This is what he was finding last week as he's chasing after these things. These things are all beautiful, they're great, wisdom and pleasure and our work and stuff, but all these things are temporary. I can spend my whole life working and then one day it's just going to be dust. It's going to go away, or somebody else could inherit my legacy and it'll all be squandered and stuff. You know, there's a beauty in all these things that are vapor, but there's something in us that longs for more and for permanence. But what's wild about it is that even in that, he said that we cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. That we long for this perspective, for this eternality, and we can't see the big picture. We could spend our entire life trying to figure out all that God's done, all that he's doing, all of how eternity works and everything. But there's a limit there. There's a barrier there. And so his conclusion, remember we're only in chapter 3, we're not at the end yet, his kind of temporary conclusion is this: I perceived that there is nothing better for them, talking about all of us, than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. But that's frustrating, right? It's frustrating to read all this and say, okay, so all this stuff's beautiful. The best thing that I can do with my time is to do good. Why? I'm going to die. It's a vapor. Everything that, you know, why would I enjoy my work? It's all going to be burned up or, you know, squandered. You know, I might have a descendant that's an idiot, you know, and it's all gone, everything I've worked for. What good is it to enjoy food and drink, even as good as it can be? It's gone, and I'm hungry again the next day. And so why is this his conclusion? It seems absurd. Goes a little bit. Hey, everything's beautiful for just a little while. It's all going to fade away, and don't worry, your heart really wants eternity anyway. Best thing you can do is just enjoy all the stuff that God has for you. If there is nothing, now again, we're suspending a little bit of Christian worldview here for a moment. If there is nothing after we die, this is wonderful advice, right? Hey, don't worry about things being temporary. The best thing you can do is just enjoy it. You can't control the seasons. Stop trying to. Enjoy them. This is God's gift to you. Enjoy your work. Enjoy your meals. Enjoy all these different things. And do your best to do good. We're all going to die anyway. Okay? He's going to make a turn, which I think is good for us, so that we don't feel like we've lost all hope. I perceived, is verse 14, that whatever God does endures how long? Forever. Everything I do, everything I'm chasing is vapor. It's going to fade away. It's not going to last. But he perceives that whatever God does completely contrasts to us, that it endures forever. And he says nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. It's complete. There's not going to be a day when it's incomplete. He says God has done it so that people fear before him. This is Old Testament word that talks about reverent fear, right? This relationship of lordship between God and people. He says that which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been. And God seeks out what has been driven away. Some of your translations might say, God can bring the past into account. This is what he's saying. All of these things are going to fade away to the rearview mirror. God has, and this is a weird Hebrew sentence to try to figure out, but essentially it's communicating God has the ability to reach into the past for things that have already been done and to do something with them, to bring it to account or to bring it to light or to use it in a judging scenario. We're about to kind of clarify this a little bit more, but he's painting the picture that while all of us are trapped in these seasons and these times, and there's a beauty in it, God is outside of time, and that what he does has an eternal quality to it, but also that he has the ability to interact through time and deal with things that people say and people do that might have happened in the past. We're going to come to the conclusion right here. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. He goes to the court where people should be making good rulings, where people should find justice. And as he looks at it, he says, even here there's wickedness. Today, right? If you watch some crime thriller shows or documentaries or different stuff, there's tons of people that have been released from DNA evidence years later, and they spent all this time in prison or whatever for a crime they didn't commit. Or there's different people that seem to get off the hook, or somebody's able to buy this person or whatever, and we look at it and we say, like, yeah, no, dude, that really, really is awful. Like, in the place where there should be justice, a lot of times there's wickedness. He says he looked in the place of righteousness, and even there was wickedness. And so, is he talking about the temple where people go to worship? Like, some place, he's talking about this place of righteousness where things should be good, and even there's wickedness and there's evil. How many of you have ever been to a church where, like, sin happened? Right? If you've been in a church, you've probably been in a church where sin happened. If you came here tonight, like, I'm sure sin has happened, okay? So, even there, where the people are seeking after righteousness, there's something that happens. And this is a big problem that people bring up with Christianity. They say, like, man, I don't get how somebody could just get off the hook. There's all this evil, there's all this injustice, there's all this brokenness in the world. Like, surely there has to be someone to do something about it. He says in verse 17, this is going to cast everything else in a different light. He said, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time for every matter and for every work. suddenly we've been given another event. We have this endless cycle of life that's vapor, and then you die. But he's introducing another event into the fold to say, after you die, there's this other moment where God, unlike the courts that can't get this right, unlike the place of righteousness that can't get this right, that God makes a judgment. We look further to the New Testament. Paul writes, it's appointed to a man once to die, and then after that, the judgment. That part of the fundamental Christian belief is that when we pass from this life, our next destination is a judgment before God, where he sees every thought. To use verse 13, he brings the past into account. No, not verse 13, verse 15. I looked at the wrong spelling page. He grabs the things that have been pulled away, the things that have happened in the past, and he's able to bring them into judgment, bring them into account. He said, verse 18, and I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God's testing them, they would see that they themselves aren't but beasts. We're not God. We don't have these qualities about us. We're temporary. He says, what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, and all is vanity. That's our word, vapor, right? He says, all go to one place, all are from dust, and to dust all return. Now, he's not making a comment about eternity to say, us and every animal, we're all going to heaven or we're all going to hell, right? You see in verse 20, he says, all are from dust, and to dust all return. He's saying this, all of us as creation have a common destination, that we're going to die and we're going to go back into the ground. Okay? At the end of all of this, is the argument he's been making, at the end of all of this, we're all creatures, our life is but a vapor, and eventually we're going to hit the end. And what has happened during the time, our brief stay on earth, is going to affect this new period, this judgment that he talks about. He asks this question, and we should have an answer to it, looking at this paragraph. He asks this question, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? Judging from this passage, who knows the answer to that question? The judge, right? Somebody's making that call. Right? Who knows whether or not the one spirit goes up or the other one goes into the earth? The judge has the answer to that question. And he comes to another temporary conclusion. It's hard to do resolution with some of these because he just keeps going. But he comes to another temporary solution. He says, so I saw there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. And who can bring him to see what will be after him? And so this, it puts everything into perspective for us a little bit. As we kind of wrap these things together, that in our lives, starting from the top of the chapter, that we go through each of these different seasons, and we can't control them. We're not designed to be able to, that these things pass by us. And the best thing that we can do in the temporariness of all the seasons that we go through is to recognize that God has put a beauty into it, that part of his gift is that we enjoy what is there in front of us in that season. Whether it's a season of joy or a season of sorrow, a season where we're surrounded by people, or a season of loneliness. Right? That he's put something beautiful in that season for us to enjoy. We've also recognized that the summation of life cannot just be that little bit of joy that we get in that moment. Right? Because there's a part of us that longs for something that's eternal. As much as we can enjoy a good meal, or we can enjoy the gifts that God's given us in those seasons, it doesn't account for eternity. And what he uses to kind of put the extra pin in there for us so that we understand is to say that, look, there's a reason why there's this longing in us for something eternal, is that we're looking forward to a day where God does bring into judgment everything that's happened in the past. All the injustices that have happened are suddenly restored and made right. All the things that happened where, I at least know in my life, there's times that I've looked at a situation and I've said, man, no one is ever going to know what this person said to me and how this person wronged me. And nobody's ever going to know these things that happened to me, or like the way I was cheated with this and all these different things. Sometimes man, some of you might have had just evil happen to you. And you say, man, that person might never come to justice on this side of eternity. What do I do with that? How do I find joy in the seasons when all of these different things How do I find joy when there's wickedness in the courts and wickedness in the church and all that stuff? And his answer is like, the way that we can find joy in those things is to recognize that there's a judgment that comes after these things. And as he continues through the book, he's going to lead us up towards that a little bit more. And the fullness of the biblical story leads us up to that. Jesus teaches in the first few chapters of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7, he gives a picture of what life looks like in his kingdom and how we should live wisely. And part of that is enjoying these gifts and stuff that he's given. But he also teaches all throughout the Gospels and through the entirety of the New Testament that life here is not permanent, and that what happens after is the biggest key. Because we can spend up all of our life here, this brief vapor that we have. But if we come to the judgment unprepared, we miss out on things for eternity. And he makes a comment when Lazarus, one of his friends, dies. One of the women comes up to him and says, like, oh, if only you'd been here sooner and stuff. And he reminds her, he says, listen, for those that believe in me, though they die, they will live again. Through Jesus, we're promised resurrection. We turn from our sin, we come to him, our relationship with him. There's a resurrection where we spend eternity with him, but also where he brings all these things into justice. Because unlike us who have incomplete information, God does not. And so, the two takeaways for us tonight in all of this is, one, we want to enjoy the beauty that he's put in front of us in this season. There's gifts that he's given to us of friends, family, our work, and all these different things that we should enjoy. And the wisest thing we can do with our time is to enjoy these gifts, right? But then secondly, we've got to make sure that we're prepared for the judgment. We've got to be checking our lives to say, even as Christians, right? To say, Lord, is there sin that I still need to turn away from? Or there's things that I need to do to prepare for this moment when my vapor of a life burns out and I'm standing before you at judgment. Right? Because in that moment, he sees through everything else and looks at us directly. And so, let me pray for us. I came in tonight and there are no screens. But I've got the questions memorized. We'll do our discussion time to kind of close it out. Let me pray for us tonight. Father, I thank you for just the gifts that you give us and the little things, big things. I pray that you would help us to live lives of wisdom and enjoy each season that we're in. Lord, help us to recognize we can't control them, but that you've put something beautiful in each season for us to find and for us to enjoy as a gift from you, Lord. I pray that you would help us also to live lives every day, recognizing that we'll one day have to give an account for every word, for every thought, for every action. I ask you help us to take heart and put our hope in the moment that you bring all evil and all injustice and all brokenness to a close. That you bring true healing and true justice that our hearts long for whenever we see tragedy and evil happen. I pray for any tonight that might just be struggling. It's a hard season and have a hard time seeing the beauty that you put wherever they may be. Lord, I just ask that you would encourage them and care for them and comfort them tonight. And I pray for any who might be here tonight that don't have a relationship with you, that they're not ready for that moment of judgment and they have to stand before you. I ask that they wouldn't leave without speaking to someone, Lord, or just even now in the chair, that they would take the time to make things right with you. We love you. We thank you. Ask that you help us to live this and help us in our discussion time, Lord, to chew through some of these things together.